For 50 years, amateur detectives, professional investigators, and true crime enthusiasts believed they had found the Zodiac Killer's first victim. The case had everything: a brutal college campus murder, mysterious letters with cryptic symbols, and a poem carved into a library desk that seemed to describe the killing in chilling detail. The victim was 18-year-old Cheri Jo Bates, a bright Riverside City College student who was savagely murdered on Halloween Eve 1966. The Zodiac connection seemed so convincing that the FBI got involved. Books were written, documentaries were made, and countless hours were spent trying to link her death to Northern California's most infamous serial killer. But in 2016, everything changed. An anonymous letter arrived at the Riverside Police Department with a confession that would shatter decades of investigation. "I wrote the letters," it said. "It was a sick joke. I am not the Zodiac Killer." 50 years. 50 years of chasing the wrong lead while Cheri Jo's real killer remained free. Today, we're diving into one of true crime's most devastating hoaxes, and the renewed investigation that's finally focusing on finding her actual murderer. Because somewhere out there, the person who brutally killed this young college student has been watching the world chase shadows for half a century. Before we unpack this incredible story of deception and determination, I want to ask for your help. Cheri Jo Bates deserves justice, and her case deserves attention from people who care about solving cold cases. If you're moved by her story like I was during my research, please hit that like button and subscribe to help keep cases like this in the public eye. Your engagement helps ensure that victims like Cheri Jo are never forgotten, and that their families never stop hoping for answers. Background, context. Cheri Josephine Bates was born on February 4, 1948, to Joseph and Irene Bates in Riverside, California. By all accounts, she was the kind of daughter every parent dreams of raising. Responsible, ambitious, and genuinely kind, Cheri Jo had graduated from Ramona High School just months earlier and was excited about starting her college journey. As a freshman at Riverside City College in the fall of 1966, she was studying to become a teacher, a profession that perfectly matched her patient and nurturing personality. She lived at home with her parents in a close-knit family arrangement that was typical of the era. Her friends described her as studious and reliable, someone who took her education seriously and had clear goals for her future. But Cheri Jo had one notable trait that would become crucial to understanding her murder. She was terribly afraid of the darkness, according to those who knew her well. This wasn't just a mild preference for well-lit areas. It was a genuine phobia that made her extremely cautious about being alone after dark. Riverside City College in 1966 was a growing institution serving the rapidly expanding Inland Empire. The campus had that optimistic, forward-looking atmosphere typical of California colleges in the mid-60s. Students felt safe there, families trusted it, and the idea that something terrible could happen in the library parking lot would have seemed absurd to most people. The campus library was a popular evening destination for students. It opened at 6 p.m. on weekdays and stayed open until 9 p.m., providing a quiet place to study and access research materials. The building was modern and well-maintained, but the surrounding parking areas and pathways were poorly lit, a design oversight that would have tragic consequences. On October 30th, 1966, Cheri Jo had every reason to feel optimistic about her future. She was excelling in her classes, had supportive friends and family, and was building toward a career helping others. She had no way of knowing that someone had been watching her, studying her routines, and planning something unspeakably evil. Timeline of events. Sunday, October 30th, 1966, started as an ordinary day for Cheri Jo Bates. She spent time at home with her family and made plans to visit the college library that evening to pick up some books for her studies. This wasn't unusual. She was a dedicated student who frequently used the library resources. At 3 p.m., Cheri Jo called her friend Stefani Gutman to ask if she wanted to come along to the library. When Stefani wasn't available, Cheri Jo called again at 3:45 p.m., hoping her friend had changed her mind. But Stefani had other plans, so Cheri Jo decided to make the trip alone, a decision that would cost her everything. Around 5:30 p.m., Cheri Jo drove her green Volkswagen Beetle to the campus and parked on Terracina Drive, directly in front of the library building. A young student who was waiting outside for the library to open at 6 p.m. later told police he had seen her sitting in her car, writing in a blue spiral notebook. This may have been the last time anyone saw Cheri Jo alive and unharmed. The library opened promptly at 6 p.m., and Cheri Jo went inside to gather the books she needed. A librarian would later tell investigators that she believed she had seen Cheri Jo in the building sometime between 6 and 9 p.m., though the exact time was unclear. What we know for certain is that Cheri Jo checked out her books and returned to her car around 6:30 p.m., expecting to drive home for dinner with her family. But when she turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. Her Volkswagen, which had been running perfectly that afternoon, was completely dead. What Cheri Jo didn't realize was that someone had deliberately sabotaged her vehicle while she was in the library. The distributor coil wire had been disconnected, and the middle pin of the distributor had been pulled out. Precise sabotage that required mechanical knowledge and careful planning. As Cheri Jo sat in her disabled car, probably frustrated and confused, her killer made his approach. This is where the investigation becomes both heartbreaking and revealing. Given Cheri Jo's extreme fear of darkness and her cautious nature, detectives are convinced she knew her attacker. This wasn't a random stranger who managed to lure her away from her car. This was someone she trusted, someone who could convince her to walk with him into the poorly lit alley between the library and an adjacent house. What happened next was a nightmare that lasted nearly 30 minutes. The physical evidence would later reveal that Cheri Jo fought desperately for her life. She clawed at her attacker's face and head with such ferocity that investigators found a trail of blood drops leading from the murder scene to Terracina Drive, indicating that her killer was significantly injured and bleeding as he fled the area. But her attacker was stronger and came prepared with a weapon. A small, sharp knife that he used with devastating efficiency. The autopsy would reveal the full horror of what Cheri Jo endured. She had been slashed 3 times across the throat, with one cut completely severing her jugular vein. She was stabbed once in the chest and once in the back. Her face was slashed across the left cheek and upper lip. The throat wounds were so severe that she was nearly decapitated. The killer left behind a substantial amount of evidence: clear fingerprints on her car door, palm prints, a military-style boot print in the dirt near her body, and most importantly, skin and blood under Cheri Jo's fingernails from her desperate defensive wounds. A broken Timex watch with a 7-inch band was found near the body, though investigators were never certain whether it belonged to the victim or the killer. When Cheri Jo failed to come home that evening, her father Joseph filed a missing person report. The family spent a sleepless night wondering where their responsible, reliable daughter could be. At 6:30 a.m. on October 31st, Halloween morning, groundskeeper Cleophas Martin was operating a street sweeper near the campus when he made the horrific discovery. Cheri Jo's body lay in a gravel driveway between 2 houses, her yellow blouse and red capri pants torn and bloodied. The crime scene told a clear story. This hadn't been a robbery. Her purse was nearby with money and identification intact. It hadn't been a sexual assault. Her clothing, while disheveled from the struggle, showed no signs of sexual violence. This was something far more personal and deliberate. Investigation details. The Riverside Police Department responded immediately and launched what would become one of their most intensive investigations. The physical evidence was substantial by 1966 standards: clear fingerprints, palm prints, boot impressions, blood evidence, and biological material under the victim's fingernails. Detective teams worked around the clock, processing the crime scene and interviewing potential witnesses. Within days, investigators had developed their primary theory. Cheri Jo knew her killer. The evidence was compelling. Her fear of darkness, the successful lure away from her car, the mechanical knowledge required to disable the vehicle, and the personal nature of the attack all pointed to someone familiar with her routines and trusted enough to approach her after dark. A primary suspect emerged early in the investigation. While his identity has never been publicly revealed, investigators have maintained for decades that this individual remains their focus. He fit the physical evidence, had connections to Cheri Jo, and exhibited behavior consistent with the crime. However, despite their suspicions, they lacked the concrete evidence needed for an arrest. Then, 6 months after the murder, everything changed in a way that would derail the investigation for half a century. In April 1967, 3 identical handwritten letters arrived simultaneously at the Riverside Police Department, the Riverside Press Enterprise newspaper, and at the home of Joseph Bates, Cheri Jo's grieving father. The messages were brief but chilling. She had to die. There will be more. The letters contained several distinctive elements that would later seem significant. They were written in an unusual hand, contained a strange symbol that resembled the letter Z with a peculiar squiggle, and were mailed with excessive postage. The envelope showed no return address, and the tone was taunting and cold. Even more disturbing was a discovery made by a library janitor around the same time. Scratched into the underside of a fold-down desk in the Riverside City College library was a macabre poem titled "Sick of Living, Unwilling to Die." The poem contained graphic references to attacking young women with a bladed weapon and seemed to describe Cheri Jo's murder in horrifying detail. The handwriting and content of both the letters and the poem convinced many investigators that they were dealing with a serial killer, someone who had killed before and would kill again. When the Zodiac Killer began terrorizing Northern California in 1968, the similarities seemed too obvious to ignore. The Zodiac used similar handwriting styles, sent taunting letters to police and newspapers, included cryptic symbols, and used excessive postage. In 1971, the connection seemed confirmed when the Zodiac himself claimed responsibility for Cheri Jo's murder in a letter to the Los Angeles Times, writing, "I do have to give them credit for stumbling across my Riverside activity, but they are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there." The FBI became involved. Handwriting experts were consulted, and the case became part of the broader Zodiac investigation. Books were written connecting Cheri Jo to the Zodiac crimes. Documentaries featured her as his first victim, and amateur investigators spent countless hours trying to decode the supposed Zodiac messages related to her murder. For nearly 50 years, this Zodiac connection dominated the investigation and public perception of the case. Resolution, current status. In April 2016, 49 years after those first mysterious letters arrived, the Riverside Police Department received another piece of mail that would shatter decades of investigation and speculation. An anonymous letter, typed and apparently generated from a computer, arrived postmarked from San Bernardino, California. The contents were shocking in their simplicity and devastating in their implications. The author confessed to writing the original 1967 letters claiming responsibility for Cheri Jo's murder. "I wrote the letters," the confession stated. "It was a sick joke. I am not the Zodiac Killer or the killer of Cheri Jo Bates. I was just looking for attention." The author apologized for the deception and explained that he had sent the letters purely as a hoax, never imagining they would derail a murder investigation for half a century. DNA analysis confirmed that this person was indeed the author of the 1967 correspondence, and further investigation verified that he had no connection to either Cheri Jo's murder or the actual Zodiac crimes. The revelation was devastating for multiple reasons. It meant that 50 years of investigation had been focused on a false lead, that countless resources had been wasted chasing a non-existent serial killer connection, and that Cheri Jo's real murderer had been free all this time while the world chased shadows. But it also meant something hopeful. Investigators could finally return their full attention to the real evidence and the actual suspect they had identified decades earlier. In December 2024, the Riverside Police Department announced that they were reopening the Cheri Jo Bates case as part of a renewed effort to solve cold cases. The department's homicide cold case unit has been working with advanced DNA analysis techniques, re-interviewing witnesses, and applying modern investigative methods to the substantial physical evidence collected in 1966. A private citizen has offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Cheri Jo's killer. The reward remains active, and investigators believe there are still people alive who have crucial information about the crime. Detective work has also revealed additional fraudulent letters claiming Zodiac connections that were sent to Northern California police agencies by attention seekers hoping to insert themselves into the famous serial killer case. Today, the investigation focuses entirely on the original evidence and the primary suspect identified in 1966. While investigators won't reveal his identity publicly, they believe acquaintances of this person may have additional information that could finally lead to justice for Cheri Jo. Reflection, impact. The Cheri Jo Bates case serves as a sobering reminder of how false information can devastate a criminal investigation. One person's sick joke cost a murder victim 50 years of misdirected investigation and gave her killer 5 decades of freedom he should never have had. But it also demonstrates the dedication of cold case investigators who never give up. Despite the setback, despite the wasted years, despite the frustration of chasing false leads, the detectives working this case have returned to the evidence with renewed determination. For Cheri Jo's family and friends, the hoax revelation was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Heartbreaking because of the lost time, but hopeful because the investigation could finally focus on finding her real killer. This case reminds us why accuracy matters in true crime reporting, why amateur investigators must be careful not to spread unverified theories, and why the pursuit of justice requires both persistence and precision. Cheri Jo Bates was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, killed by someone who has escaped justice for 58 years. If this case moved you, if you believe every victim deserves justice no matter how much time has passed, please help keep her story alive by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement ensures that cases like Cheri Jo's stay in the public eye, where they belong. And remember, if you have any information about this case, the Riverside Police Department is still actively investigating. Justice may be delayed, but it's never too late. Someone out there knows what happened to Cheri Jo Bates on that October night in 1966. With your help sharing her story, maybe today is the day they finally come forward.